Greetings. For a while now, I've been interested in the subject of the word Easter appearing in the King James Bible, and specifically Acts 12:4. And for quite some time, I've been aware of the fact that this was not an innovation of the King James Version. Rather, a number of preceding Protestant translations also put the word Easter at Acts 12:4. Last November, I posted a little video, less than 2-minute video, to Twitter showing that the same is the case with Martin Luther's translation into German, which would be the first Protestant translation. And I thought that made an interesting contribution to the topic, but I recently learned that the subject is yet a bit more complex still, and so I'd like to discuss the subject a bit more in depth in this video. So again, here's the bilingual edition of the Bible I was using, which puts side by side the King James and the Martin Luther's translation into German, and I'm going to go to the verses that I had looked at in my original video on Twitter, which are in Acts 12. So here we are in the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, or it says here Apostelgeschichte in German. And this is Acts chapter 12, as I said. You see here, again, 12th chapter. And as was already covered, the preliminary point is that the word Easter appears in the King James Bible, and so too in Martin Luther's translation we find the word Ostern. Now, I felt it was initially important to point that out because it shows that the practice of putting Easter at Acts 12 goes back to the very beginning of Protestant translations of the Bible. However, I learned that unlike the King James, the word Easter is not limited to just Acts 12:4 in Martin Luther's translation. So here we are in 1 Corinthians 5, and I'm going to go down to verse 7. Which states that Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us, essentially calling Christ our Passover lamb. Yet when we go to Martin Luther's translation of 1 Corinthians 5:7, we find the word Osterlam, meaning Easter lamb, or one that has been lambed for Easter. It says Osterlam, das ist Christus. In short, in Martin Luther's translation of 1 Corinthians 5:7, Christ is called the Osterlam, the Easter lamb, rather than the Passover lamb. And the reality is that in all 29 places where the word Pascha appears in the Greek New Testament, Martin Luther's translation renders it either Ostern or Osterlam. So now let me show this, just a few examples of this. I'm going to go to Matthew, the 26th chapter of Matthew. Bear with me here. And let's see. Okay, here we are. We're in Matthew 26. And being that I'm working with this bilingual edition, which puts the King James side by side with Martin Luther's translation, we'll look at both in these various verses in Matthew 26. And so we see Passover at verse 2 in the King James, and then we can go over here to, bear with me, verse 17. Again, we see the word Passover in the King James. Verse 18, again, we find the word Passover, and then, hold on, there's one more here. In verse 19, again, we find the word Passover. Switching from the King James to Martin Luther's translation, and verse 2, we see the word Ostern right here. Hold on, bear with me. There it is, the word Ostern right there. And now if we go to the other verses we looked at, the corresponding verses, in verse 17, what we find is, here we go, the word Osterlam, again, the Easter lamb. And then in verse 18, again, we find the word Ostern, I'm sorry, but forgive me. And again in verse 19, we find yet again the word Osterlam, again, the Easter lamb. Now, not to belabor the point, but permit me to show a few more examples. I'm going to jump over to the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. So I'll try to go through these other examples relatively quickly, but here we are in Matthew 14, in verse 1, in the King James translation, the King James Version. Again, Mark 14, not Matthew 14, forgive me. In the verse 1, you find Passover, and then we can go to Martin Luther's translation, and there in 14:1, we find, here it is right here, it's going to be Osterlam, where is it? Oh, no, I'm sorry, it's Ostern. Ostern in 14:1, Mark 14:1. Let me turn the page. We'll go to the next page. As in verse 12 here, we find the word Passover, as you see right there, Passover verse 12. Then at verse 14 in the King James, again, the word Passover. And then verse 16, again, this is 14th chapter of Mark. Again, we find the word Passover. Again, this is, so Mark 12:14, Mark 14:12, 14:14, 14:16. Going to Martin Luther's translation, in verse 12, we find Osterlam again. In verse 14, we find, bear with me one second. Here we go. We find the word Osterlam yet again. And now going to verse 16, once again, we find the word Osterlam right here at the end. Now, I think I've shown enough examples from the New Testament. I'm not going to go through all 29 verses where the word Pascha appeared and how Martin Luther and the King James translated it. I think everyone will find that rather tedious to go through all the verses. However, putting the New Testament aside, we can turn to the Old Testament, as Martin Luther also put the word Ostern in some verses there. For example, we're in Exodus 35, actually 34. I'm going to go to the 25th verse. This is in the King James Bible. And at Exodus 34:25, we find a reference to the feast of the Passover in the King James translation. Now, comparing that with Martin Luther's translation of Exodus 34:25, what do we find? We find the word Osterfestes, which means the feast of Easter, Easter feast. And now I'll give one more example from the Old Testament. I'm going to turn to Second Chronicles, the 30th chapter of Second Chronicles. So here we are, Second Chronicles 30. And I'm going to go to to verse 18. So again, this is Second Chronicles 30:18 in the King James Bible first. So here we go. Here we go in verse 18, which makes a reference to eating the Passover. Going to Martin Luther's translation of that same verse, which will also be discussing eating the Passover. And now, to be clear, this is going to be eating the Passover lamb. That's the implication. What we find in verse 18 is once again the word Osterlam, because it was referring to the Paschal lamb. I think that's quite interesting. Now, what we see in this comparison is that, on the one hand, the Martin Luther's use of Ostern, the German word for Easter, at Acts 12:4 shows that the King James practice of putting Easter there in Acts 12:4 goes back to the very beginning of Protestant translations. However, where Martin Luther's translation diverges significantly from the King James translation, the King James Version, is that, unlike the KJV, Martin Luther's translation has references to Easter at every single point where Pascha is mentioned in the New Testament, and it also has it in a few places in the Old Testament. And now I'd like to switch gears and propose that just as the King James rendering of Acts 12:4 had a history of tradition behind it, so too Martin Luther's practice of putting Easter all over the New Testament had a history behind it, a history of tradition behind it. What you see here is an edition of the Gospel of Matthew, which reproduces Anglo-Saxon and Northumbrian versions of roughly 1,000-year-old English translations of the Gospel into Old English, into a form of English that existed roughly 1,000 years ago. You can find this online on archive.org, and I'll share a link in the video description to this work. And now I'm going to turn to the start of Matthew 26, which is on page 200 of the relevant work. And as we zoom in on verse 2, Matthew 26:2, what we find is the word Istro. And then we can scroll over to the right to the Northumbrian, the corresponding Northumbrian version, and what we find there is the corresponding word Ister, or Istre. I'm not entirely sure about the proper pronunciation, but I think it's fairly obvious that in both versions, these are Old English words corresponding to the word Easter, or Ostern in German. And we can jump to a following page, which has verses 17, 18, and 19. And when we look there, what we find in both versions is, again, variations of basically the word Easter. Now, at this point, I can imagine that there are certain people with a bit more of a polemical sentiment in their hearts who will say, I don't care if the word Easter appears in the King James or in Martin Luther's translation or in 1,000-year-old Old English translations. It's madness no matter who did it. Now, I'm not going to tell you that you have to accept these translations. Far from it. I'm just showing them for the historical record as, a sort of historical note. But I would attempt to offer a slightly more nuanced view of what was happening here. I would say these points are worthy of note. First, the Teutonic calendar, the calendar used by various Germanic peoples and also certain English-speaking peoples, was lunar solar, which is to say it was a lunar calendar, but one which stayed consistent with the seasons, similar to the Hebrew calendar. Second, both the Old Passover, the Old Testament Passover, and the Dominican Pascha, the holiday now called Easter, were called Pascha in Latin. They're still called Pascha in ecclesiastical Latin to this day. And by the way, I use the adjective Dominican as the alternative or antonym to Quartodeciman. So the Dominican Pascha would be the Pascha which falls on the first Sunday after the Quartodeciman Pascha, or after the Old Passover. And both feasts consistently fell in a month on the Teutonic calendar with a name along the lines of Östre, which was the etymological ancestor of the English word Easter and the German word Ostern. And ultimately, both feasts, which were called Pascha in Latin, came to be referred to by the name of that month on the Teutonic calendar, within which they consistently fell in, various Teutonic languages, various Germanic languages, whether it be older forms of German, older forms of English, and whatever the common ancestor of those languages were. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense because the Old Passover consistently falls at the middle of the lunar month, and the Dominican Pascha, what's popularly called Easter in English, falls roughly on the following Sunday. And so these feasts would consistently fall within the same lunar month, even if they don't fall in the same month consistently on solar calendars like the Julian calendar or the Gregorian calendar. Now, regarding the name of that month, Bede does say that it was named after a goddess. However, I would offer this analogy. Suppose your church had a Bible study which consistently fell in the middle of the week, and in English it came to be referred to as the Wednesday Bible study. Now, the word Wednesday has within its etymology the name of Woden or Odin, this god from Northern Europe, this deity from Northern Europe. However, if someone was naming their Bible study the Wednesday Bible study, they wouldn't actually intend that as an homage to Odin or Woden, because by the time that their Bible study took on that name Wednesday, it was long after the word had lost explicit or conscious reference to Odin. And so, too, within the Teutonic calendar, by the time it had been Christianized, it may well have been the case that the name of this month had lost all of its conscious pagan reference by the time that month started to give its name over to the feasts which fell within it. Also, on a quick side note, Martin Luther didn't always use Ostern to translate references to the Passover in the Old Testament. Sometimes he had words like Passa. And I share that just to note that it may be the case that his intention when he was using Ostern in the Old Testament was he saw those verses as having Christian application, and therefore he used the common colloquial Christian term from his time and environment. Whatever the case, because Easter, Istro, Östre, Öster, Ostern, or whatever became the way to say Pascha in these various Germanic languages, it's understandable that early translations into these Teutonic languages would render verses which would typically refer to Pascha in that way. With that, I'll close here, but before closing, I just want to give a little credit to the Infinitely Manic account on Twitter, which encouraged me to look a bit closer at Luther's translation and also look at the Anglo-Saxon translations of the Gospels, and when I did so, that's what inspired me to make this video, so a certain amount of credit is due to that gentleman, and this is precisely why I like receiving comments from others, because there's a potential to learn from anyone, and lots of people have lots of interesting insights. So, as always, I look forward to the comments of others, and with that, I'll close this video the same way I've closed many previous videos. God bless.